Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be covering Chapter 3, Where Prices Come From, the Interactions of Supply and Demand. This video will be a little bit longer because we are covering both the supply and demand side of the market, but I will try to keep it as concise as possible in the meanwhile. And also, there are a few worksheet pages that I've included on W2 class. I plan to reveal the answers to those in a couple weeks, so y'all have plenty of time to go ahead and practice them for yourselves. It's really important that you understand the foundations of supply and demand because the course just builds upon these concepts moving forward, and the majority of the last unit is over supply and demand concepts and understanding how that relates to the overall economy. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So, again, like I said, we'll be covering the demand side and the supply side of the market. We'll also be talking about market equilibrium, and then in that very last section, I'm not going to talk about it in depth too much, but I'm going to let you practice shifting the curves and the impact of that on equilibrium. So let's go ahead and get started. So the example in the book uses Nike, and it refers to the Duke University game in which one of the players' Nike shoes split wide open during the game, and the criticism Nike then received on social media due to this occurrence. The question it poses is, should or suppose fans' desire to buy Nike shoes decreases, how would this affect the price of Nikes and how many Nikes are sold? So, in order to analyze this specific market for Nike athletic shoes, we're going to need a model to represent how buyers and sellers behave. In this model, we'll be making a few assumptions. One, that it'll be a model market with many buyers and sellers. Two, all the firms will be selling identical products. And three, there aren't going to be any barriers to entry for new firms entering the market. The assumptions seem fairly restrictive, but again, models are just maps. They're simplified version of reality. They are unable to take in every single what if or potential consequence. We're just trying to analyze specific things in our model. So we're going to start with the demand side of the market. When we talk about the demand side, I want you to think consumers. And so that should be fairly easy to relate to yourself since we are all consumers. And that's the perspective I want you to take when we're talking about the demand side of the market. So, what is market demand? Market demand is the demand by all the consumers of a given good or service. When looking at market demand, we have two essentially ways to convey this information. We have what's called a demand schedule, which is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a specific product and the quantity of the product demanded. And we have what we call the demand curve, which is a graphical representation, a curve that shows the relationship between the price of the product and the quantity of the product demanded. So what do you mean by quantity demanded, let's say? What do I mean by quantity demanded? What I mean is the amount of a good or service that a consumer is willing and able to purchase at a given price. So it's the amount that you purchase at specific prices. So here we have two examples of our demand schedule and our demand curve. The table shows 5 different prices of goods, in this case, Nike shoes, and the quantity demanded at that specific price. So what we can do here is, I'm not making you graph this out, it's already graphed out. But if we have points that correspond to each price, we can graph what our demand curve will look like. So point A at price 150, we have a quantity demanded of 8 million pairs of shoes per week. At price 125, we have a quantity demanded of 9 million. At 100, we have quantity demanded of 10 million, and so on and so forth. So we can label each of these corresponding points. On the demand curve that match the demand schedule. Okay, so we can see here we have a downward sloping demand curve. So when I think demand starts with a D, downward sloping, downward starts with a D. So that's how I remember which way the demand curve slopes. But we can also think about the demand curve in terms of the law of demand. The law of demand states that ceteris paribus, all else equal, when the price falls, quantity demanded rises. When the price rises, quantity demanded falls. Remember, we're thinking about this from the consumer's perspective, so this seems fairly straightforward, right? When the price of a product, in this case, when the price of a pair of sneakers falls, the amount consumers are willing to buy at that specific price rises. So that's why there is a negative slope for our demand curve. There's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. So I said this word, ceteris paribus. I went ahead and defined it up here. Ceteris paribus is Latin for all else equal. This is the requirement that when analyzing the relationship between two variables, it can be any two variables. In this case, it's price and quantity demanded. Other variables must be held constant. Trying to highlight that. Other variables must be held constant. So we're just looking at price and quantity demanded. If we don't hold other variables constant, our model won't be effective because we're only trying to isolate these two specific variables and simplify our model. Okay, so what explains the law of demand? The law of demand is explained by two specific effects. When the price of a good falls, there's two effects that take place. One is the substitution effect, and the other is our income effect. The substitution effect essentially says that the change in quantity demanded of a good that results from a change in price, making a good more or less expensive relative to other goods that are substitutes. So when the price of a good falls, consumers will typically substitute or switch towards the good whose price has fallen. Now let's talk about the income effect. That's when the change in the quantity demanded of a good that results from the effect of a change in the good's price on consumers' purchasing power. So again, when the price of a good falls, it feels like you as the consumer have a greater purchasing power. It's similar to an increase in income, which is why we call it an income effect. Okay. So now let's talk about shifting the demand curve. Shifting the demand curve is caused by something other than price that affects demand. It causes the entire curve to shift. A shift to the right is referred to as an increase in demand. A shift to the left is referred to a decrease in demand. And there are 5 factors that shift the demand curve. Keep in mind that as the demand curve shifts, the quantity demanded will change, even if the price doesn't change. The quantity demanded changes at every possible price. So make sure you understand that a shift in the demand curve is different from a movement along the demand curve. And we'll talk about this related to supply in a little bit more detail. So what are these 5 factors that shift the demand curve? We have income, price of related goods, tastes, population and demographics, and expected future prices. So let's start off with income. Changes in income from a consumer perspective. So when we're analyzing changes in income and how that affects demand, we first need to identify whether a good is a normal good or an inferior good. A normal good is something where when you have more income, you usually consume more, while an inferior good is one which you consume less of as your income rises. So I put some examples out here by the side of normal goods: retail, restaurants, travel, designer goods, those things, versus inferior goods, ramen noodles for college students, generic brands, secondhand items, thrift store items, used furniture. Those things are can be classified as inferior goods. So, why does this matter? Because there's a difference in how the demand curve reacts depending on what type of good it is. Let's take travel for an example. Under the assumption, if you didn't notice, in economics you do make quite a few assumptions. But let's assume that all the COVID travel restrictions have been lifted and you experience a pay raise. And so you want to plan a nice trip to Europe, perhaps, or to the Caribbean or something like that. So that would be classified as a normal good. So if your income rises, demand for that vacation, that normal good, would increase, which results in a right shift in the demand curve for that fancy vacation. However, if your income decreased, then you'll see a decrease in demand of that normal good, which causes a left shift in the market demand for that specific good. So, if we talk about how the pandemic has impacted the jobs of many restaurant workers, hospitality workers, that could have caused their income to fall. Therefore, demand for other normal goods would also fall. Okay, so let's think about inferior goods on the other hand. Inferior goods, we already identified what some examples would be. So, inferior goods, as your income rises, demand for those goods is going to decrease, causing a left shift. But if your income falls, demand for those goods would rise, causing a right shift. So, if you were in the position in which you lost your job, then generic brands, secondhand items, used furniture may become more attractive. You may demand more of those types of goods because you have less income. Okay, so what about changes in the prices of related goods? So we're talking about goods that aren't the market that aren't in the market you're currently analyzing. They're related to that market, but changes in the price of those goods do affect the market that you're analyzing. So we classify these related goods into two categories: substitutes and complements. Substitutes are goods and services that can be interchanged for one another. They can be used for the same purpose. Fairly self-explanatory. Complements, on the other hand, those are goods and services that are used together. They're consumed together. So if we think about substitutes, the example I use here is an iPhone versus Samsung, or Apple versus Samsung. So you may not view them as substitutes if you are extremely brand loyal to one versus the other, but for example's sake, let's use them as a substitute. So if the price of Samsung, let's say Samsung is the substitute for Apple, if the price of a Samsung phone increases, what will happen is that demand for Apple will increase because people switch away from the higher priced good to the lower priced good. So you'll see a right shift in the demand curve for Apple iPhones. However, if the price of Samsung decreases, then you're going to see a substitution towards the lower priced phone, and demand for Apple will fall. So you'll see a left shift in the demand curve for iPhones if the price of Samsung phones falls. Okay, so what about complements? Complements could include left and right shoes, perhaps a Big Mac and a Whopper would be, excuse me, that's an example of a substitute. Think about a hot dog and a hot dog bun be complements that are consumed together. So let's say you are planning on hosting a huge backyard barbecue for 4th of July. You know that you're going to have to buy like 5 dozen hot dog buns and 5 dozen hot dogs. And so you see that a store has a great sale on hot dog buns, and you know you're already going to have to buy hot dogs, you have to consume them together, right? Um, so you see the price of hot dog buns is lower. What happens for the demand, your demand of hot dogs? Price of hot dog buns is lower, so the demand for hot dogs is going to be higher. Vice versa. If hot dog buns suddenly go way up in price, are you going to buy hot dogs? No, you're going to switch away from hot dogs. You're going to be like, okay, let me do burgers or something like that. And so if the price of a complement increases, demand for the other good is going to decrease. Okay, so the last three factors are a little bit more self-explanatory, but changes in taste do cause demand to shift. People may consume more or less depending on their preferences. So, a interesting topic I like to keep up with is the streaming services cable movie theater debate. So, ever since Disney Plus came out, the streaming service industry has really experienced a surge. And so, if more and more young people are preferring to, stay in, not go to the movies, stream something on Netflix, Hulu, HBO, Disney Plus, they're shifting their preferences away from going out to the movies towards staying in. If more people decide to cut the cable and instead subscribe to these streaming services, again, more people are switching preferences and taste towards a specific good or service in this case. So this is just an interesting example to follow when it comes to demand for streaming services as people's tastes change. Okay, the fourth one is population and demographics. Think about how age, race, gender, and socioeconomic status affect consumption. So, an example of this would be healthcare. So, as the baby boomer population becomes older and older, their demand for healthcare services and goods is going to increase. There's more people demanding more services as they get older. If you think about the potential development of a neighborhood surrounding an elementary school, for example, that development may try to build homes with multiple bedrooms to accommodate for several children, or they may try to market towards businesses that cater to families with young children, for example, children's clothing stores, children's toy stores, activities for children, dance studios, those types of things, perhaps even like an arcade or something like that. Depending on the demographic and population, demand is going to change. Okay, finally, expected future prices. When it comes to expected future prices, keep in mind consumers decide which products they're going to buy and they decide when to buy those products. Future products are substitutes for current products. So, an expected increase in the price tomorrow will increase demand today, while an expected decrease in the price tomorrow will decrease demand today. Think about gasoline prices. If gasoline prices were expected to go up to $10 tomorrow, we would all stop what we're doing. You would stop watching this video. You would take every container out of your house and immediately go to the gas station and fill up every single container you owned with gasoline, right? And then you would attempt to sell it to the people who didn't realize they needed to go demand more gasoline today if they think the price is going to go up tomorrow, or if they know the price is going to go up tomorrow. So you've already learned something in economics. But with that being said, if you found out the price of gasoline is going to go up tomorrow to $10, you would increase your demand today, and vice versa. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the demand side. Again, it is important to remember there is a difference between the change in demand and change in quantity demanded. Remember, a movement along the curve is a change in quantity demanded, while a shift of the curve is a change in demand. So kind of bring it back to our example. In order to forecast future demand for athletic shoes, manufacturers have to anticipate how demand is going to change. How will incomes of consumers change? Will consumers' tastes change? Will consumer demographics change? So if exercising and eating healthy goes by the wayside, then people may not need running shoes anymore. And so that's something that manufacturers and companies have to consider. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at the supply side of the market. Supply side of the market focuses on producers. So just like with the demand side, we have a schedule and a curve that corresponds to the supply side of the market. We can see here we have different prices, but in this case, we are looking at how much a producer is willing to supply at specific prices. So at price 150, how many shoes, is Nike able to sell or willing to sell? They're willing to sell 12 million pairs of shoes. At 125, they're willing to sell 11 million, and so on and so forth. So we see an upward sloping supply curve. So that represents a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Quantity supplied, again defined here, is the amount of a good or service that a firm is willing to supply at a given price. Remember, we're thinking about the producer side of things now. And the law of supply that governs our supply curve and supply schedule, ceteris paribus, as the price falls, quantity supply will fall. When the price rises, quantity supplied will rise. There's a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied, which makes sense. Companies, individuals, they want to be as profitable as they can. So when they see a price increase, they're going to supply more out into the market. Quantity supplied will increase. Here, I have just explained again the difference between a change in supply and the change in quantity supplied. Change in supply is caused by something other than price that affects supply. Change in quantity supplied is shown by a movement along the supply curve. Movement along the supply curve. So it's a really important aspect to note, the difference between change in QS and a change in S. And I have just inserted the graph here that shows what an increase and decrease in supply looks like. A movement along the supply curve would look like this, going from A to B. That was an ugly looking B. Here we go. Okay. So just like we had factors that shift the demand curve, we have factors that shift the supply curve. Price of inputs, technological change, price of related goods in production, number of firms in the market, expected future prices. So with factors that shift the supply curve, we want to still think about production. So what about prices of inputs? These are used in the production of a good or service. One of my friends just recently started her own home baking business, and so if I think about the prices of inputs in her home business, flour, sugar, butter, milk, eggs, fruit, vanilla, chocolate, boxes to put the baked goods in, labels, all that sort of thing. If the prices of those inputs go up, then she may not be willing to accept as many orders. Supply will decrease and shift left. If the prices of those inputs decrease, then she can buy more inputs for the same cost. Supply will increase and shift right. Okay, what about technological change? So if productivity increases, supply is going to increase and shift to the right. If productivity decreases, supply will decrease and shift to the left. Think about the assembly line. When the assembly line was implemented, it became much easier to manufacture motor vehicles. The supply increased, and we saw a right shift in the supply curve of automobiles. Remember, technology doesn't necessarily have to be something tangible. It could be a new idea that's turned into something tangible. It's a way to increase productivity. Now, related goods in production. So many firms can produce and sell alternative products, substitutes in production. So let's take an agricultural example. Personally, I had to make this decision recently, not with corn and soybeans, but with corn and sorghum. So, should I grow corn or should I grow sorghum on this specific piece of land that I own? So, in this case, we're using corn and soybeans, but when the price of corn increases, then a farmer may choose to produce corn instead of soybeans. So the supply of soybeans is going to fall, and the soybean supply curve is going to shift to the left. However, if prices of corn decrease, which in my case they had, then you may switch towards a crop that has a higher price. Supply of soybeans will increase and shift to the right. So, soybeans in this case, when the price of corn changes, may be relatively more expensive or less expensive than corn. And so the soybean market will be affected by the prices in the corn market. So, what about complements? Sometimes two goods are produced together. In this example, we can use cattle and beef and leather. So, if the price of beef increases, then ranchers may be encouraged to increase their herd, and that in turn increases the supply of leather in the leather market. So you'll see a right shift in the supply of leather. However, if prices of cattle fall, then supply of leather will subsequently fall as well because ranchers will substitute away from raising cattle and may opt to do something else. And so the leather market is affected by changes in the beef market. As far as number of firms in the market, um, always think back to an example I saw while I was in high school. It was when frozen yogurt was all the rage. So it seemed like every other corner had a frozen yogurt shop on it. there was orange leaf, and then there was one called Just Chillin' that popped up, and there was one called Frazzleberry that popped up, and Just Chillin' and Frazzleberry were local ones, but Orange Leaf was the chain one. And all of these ones kept popping up because it was so popular to go get frozen yogurt. So we saw the number of firms in the frozen yogurt market increase, so supply shifts right. When supply shifts right, you'll see once you start practicing that price decreases. And so impacts profitability. So over time, what happened is those locally owned shops went out of business, and only the franchise Orange Leaf remains. What happens is when firms go out of business, then number of firms in the market falls, and the supply curve will shift left, rising, increasing the price. I always like to think about this example, and I kind of see it happening with the um, protein, like teas and shakes. I see a lot of stores opening up that sell those things, and it makes sense because the overhead cost of opening a protein shake business seems fairly straightforward and not that expensive. But I think eventually, once that craze quiets down, you'll see quite a few businesses go out of operation. Okay. Finally, we have the expected future prices again. So if expected future price increases tomorrow, suppliers, producers will pull their product off the shelf today. So supply today will fall in order for them to capitalize on the higher prices they expect to see the next day. Okay, so that about sums up supply. So let's put them two together. Market equilibrium. Market equilibrium is a situation in which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So here we're looking at the market of athletic shoes. So this not only includes Nike, but also Under Armour, Adidas, Reebok. I think I spelled Adidas wrong. There we go. Etc. So in this example market, our equilibrium price is 100. We see the market equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect, the two curves intersect, and we see our equilibrium quantity of 10 million pairs of shoes sold per week. So since quantity supplied and quantity demand are equal, price is not going to change. Buyers and sellers want to trade the same exact quantity at the same exact price, and so the price won't change. However, what happens when we see the price increase from 100 to 125? Then we are pricing our product above market equilibrium, and so we are going to have a quantity supplied and quantity demanded that are different. So in this case, our quantity supplied is now we have to go over to the red supply curve and drop straight down. Quantity supplied is 11 million. In order to find quantity demanded, we have to use the blue demand curve and drop straight down to our x-axis, and we have a quantity demanded of 9 million. So since quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, we see a surplus of 2 million pairs of shoes. So 11 minus 9 equals 2. That's where we see our $2 million surplus. Now, what if prices fell to $50 instead of $100? Now we are at a price below market equilibrium. So we have a new quantity demanded and new quantity supplied. Our quantity supplied in this case, we have to use the red supply curve. Quantity supplied is 8 million. Quantity demanded, go over the blue curve, drop straight down, is 12 million. So since quantity demanded in this case is greater than quantity supplied, there's going to be a shortage of 4 million. So 8 minus 12 equals negative 4. You're going to see a shortage of 4 million pairs of shoes. So when prices are higher than market equilibrium, what will happen? What will happen is sellers compete and drive prices down. And what happens if prices are lower than market equilibrium? Sellers will raise prices. Because they can raise them and still sell the same amount that they were selling at the lower price. So remember, price is determined by the interaction between these buyers and sellers in the market. In a competitive market, neither group can dictate the price. However, changes in supply and demand, they do affect the price and quantity traded. So those are the factors that we identified. That's the changes that impact the demand curve, and these are the changes that impact the supply curve. They do change the price and quantity traded. Okay. Finally, 3.4, the effect of supply or of demand and supply shifts on equilibrium. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but now it's time for you to practice. Look at those worksheet pages that I posted in the Chapter 3 module. I'm not going to make the answers available just yet. I want you to have some time to go ahead and practice that on your own. Again, it's really important that you master this because we talk about it throughout the rest of the course, and if you don't understand it now, you will be struggling and behind the rest of the course. So if there's anything you didn't understand during this lecture or you have questions on, please feel free to let me know.